Tunç, are you going to start? Shall I?
Tunç is going to chair it, but you introduce.
Yeah, if you want first.
Say a few words about EMAR.
Yeah. My name is Ali. I am from EMAR, Labor Research Center. We've been organizing these seminars for, this is the 35th one, I think. How many years? 2 years? 3 years?
Oh, 3 years.
More than 3 years, if you calculate the pandemic. So today, we are going to listen to Francisco about Latin America, and Tunç will be chairing the meeting. And shall we continue?
Yeah, thank you very much for kicking off, as British say. Listen, I can't really, when it comes to Francisco, I can't be impersonal, because in 1997, as a personal, as political, right? I started in 1997 at Middlesex University, a young, wide-eyed research fellow at the cover lecture, and Francisco was one of my first mentors. I would, and it's a pleasure for me personally, and in every sense an honor for me to chair this session. And then Francisco and I, at that time we had this politics and Spanish and Latin American, really interesting degrees. And Francisco used to throw Latin American nights.
Yeah.
And then students, we didn't have this kind of distance between students and the lecturers. And we had great time, you know, the Latin American. By the way, Francisco is a very good salsa dancer. he's got lots of hidden talents. But as I said, Francisco has been an inspiration for me in many senses. And so, you know, when I remember those days at Tottenham campus, the bar, the nights we spent in the bar talking about politics. But of course, Francisco is not just a Latin American specialist, but also practitioner, as you know, heavily involved, the praxis, not just about theory, but he's, I mean, we know that the Chilean example for us, you know, Allende period and everything. At the same time, the 1979, on that period, we had similar things. Pinochet, you have Pinochet, and Francisco arrived in this country in 1979. And of course, trade unionism. Of course, you read this, but there is more to Francisco than what's written here. So, yeah, and also, not only Francisco, Latin America has always been inspiration for us in many senses, because there's Cuban Revolution, and then there's a strong Marxist tradition in Latin America, and then we all are familiar with Latin American Marxist writers and everything. And then Francisco has been an inspiration of Latin America. So we are to hear from Francisco what's happening, the rise of, again, sort of against the current in the rest of the world, the rise of left. So I'm really looking forward to this. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Francisco. Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you. That's a very generous presentation. I hope I do justice to it. Anecdotally, I remember I invited a bunch of indigenous people from Ecuador, which are known as the Shuar. We call them Jibaros. And they came with with no attire, with sort of typical, almost nothing here, bare chest, barefoot, with feathers. And as an anthropologist was actually taking them around the place, and I organized this thing very quickly. The room was full, more 60, 70 students. And I will never forget it. It's one of those moments, you know, which you will always remember. And they went with some sort of ritual, and they were singing something that nobody understood, but shaking some instruments. And then he said, "We are the Shuar," he said. "We come from Ecuador, we shrink heads. These are the tribes." And everybody was shocked. And he said, don't worry, we don't do it anymore because it's illegal now. Which, you know, it sort of encapsulates all the complexities of Latin America. But let me get to the point. We became the locale of the experiment to introduce neoliberalism. I mean, first Chile and then the rest of Latin America. The very first time when neoliberalism, in a brutal manner, was imposed in the world was in Chile, before Margaret Thatcher and before Ronald Reagan. And it was done with total brutality. And the brutality was such that if you opposed them, they would kill you. It was that simple. And the Pinochet regime transformed not only the economy completely, eliminated the intervention of the state in the economy, which had been rather large, especially under Allende. Then privatized absolutely everything they could. They privatized water, utilities, telephone. In Chile today, even the motorways are private. If they could have privatized air, they would have done it, but they don't have the technology. So that lasted for 17 years, and what they managed to do was not only to transform the economy and make it the most neoliberal country in the world, more than the US, definitely much more, even today as we speak, but also they transformed the people. The people became neoliberal. And the reason is that they managed to ensure levels of consumption that were very high, you know, historically speaking, in comparison. So, for example, by 2020, 2021, the level of poverty in Chile, as recognized by the United Nations measures and so on, was about 8%. The level of scholarity, you know, primary school kids was about 98%. And if you went to every place, you know, I visited my family after the exile, and I remember the first thing they did, they got one remote control and gave it to me after greeting me. I said, turn it on. And it was a huge television. We were very poor. We didn't have television at my time. So I turned this thing, he says, color, you know. And he said, would you like some French? French television, English television, Italian television. He said, it's only 78 channels. We cannot afford more. There is another package. So you could see why people were transformed. But that was the exception. It was a total exception. And I think the Chilean left has a problem with coming to terms with that. Not that I have the answers, but I know we have to act differently there compared to other places. But in the rest of Latin America, it was so brutal, and it was so nasty. And nobody else in the region got the benefits, as we could call them, as the people in Chile got. So these were approximately from the 70s, mid-70s, all the way to the 90s, about 25, 30 years of brutal neoliberalism that impoverished the population so much that at one point, specialists and economists and people that I remember reading were suggesting that there was a huge amount of spare humanity in Latin America that wanted to be exploited, but they were not exploited because there was no job for them. So people were desperate to be exploited, you know, at least to get an income. Just to give you an idea, the level of poverty in, say, places such as, we're talking about 2000, the levels of poverty in well-off places such as Argentina, much more developed, 30-35%, which is quite high in historical terms for them. But in other places such as Central America, in Honduras, for example, it was 78%. There was one moment in Nicaragua at that time that the level of unemployment in Managua, the capital city, was 90%. This was, accepted figures by the government as well as by
9%?
90. It was accepted by Nicaraguan. So people managed to survive by, being in the informal sector. In places such as Bolivia, and this is a legacy still there, the level of informality, the proportion of the population, active, economically active population that were part of the informal sector was 65%. Today, as we speak, Peru never changed to the left only recently. And as we speak today, Peru is 73% of informality. Today, much worse than Bolivia, even though in terms of the macroeconomic figures, Peru is better off than Bolivia. Bolivia is poorer. So the whole region was brutalized to incredible levels, and the resistance of the people, which there was, and there was plenty of it, was met with total violence. I mean, it was systemic. So I want to give you some figures to justify this claim. In 17 years of military dictatorship in Chile, they assassinated about 5,000 people, which is, is quite horrific. In Argentina, next door, in 6 years, 32,000. In Nicaragua, when they launched the contra-war against the Nicaraguans, the total number of people that were assassinated, murdered, butchered was 50,000. In Peru, during the dirty war against the Shining Path, the total number of people assassinated was 70,000. In El Salvador, when the US supported the death squads, in large quantities with money, training, equipment, and so on, between 1980 and 1990, the total number of people butchered was 80,000. And next door in Guatemala, 120,000. There's more, but I'll give you an idea. So you can imagine, when I think about it, now as a sort of cool-headed academic, how the heck these people continue fighting back, given that level of brutality and that amount of onslaught. But they did. And one of the surprises was the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in 1998. And there is a misperception about this. It is understandable. People think that he got elected and everything else happens right away. It's not true. Hugo Chavez was isolated from 1998 all the way to 2003. This was a government that managed to get approved in a very big referendum a new constitution which was anti-neoliberal. I remember reading the document, I just couldn't believe it. I thought he's not going to get away with it. The Yanks will not allow it. But he did. So imagine, this is a country that is rich in oil. The key commodity is oil, has the largest deposit of oil in the world, more than Saudi Arabia. And then it was a crucial client of the United States. And to have the audacity, the temerity, to actually bring about this constitutional change was just, you had to have ball. And between 1998 and 2003, he suffered enormous pressure from the United States, including a coup d'etat in 2002 that lasted 47 hours. The people came back and rescued him, put him back in power. So this was a signal that something was going to change, but it was going to be very difficult. We know this with hindsight. At the time we didn't. And in other words, Cuba was in real trouble because of the collapse of the USSR. A real severe problems. I visited Cuba for the first time in 1993, and my goodness, this was really, I thought it was not going to survive. So to have the new government, this left-wing government in 1998, in a sea of neoliberalism in the whole region. And then in 2002, 2003, Lula is elected in Brazil. That changed things quite dramatically. And then there was a torrent of transformation. Because of time, I'm going to skip over to the second. That was the first pink time. And there were left-wing governments in Argentina, in Ecuador, certainly in Honduras, Venezuela, some places in the Caribbean, some moderate wingers in Dominican Republic. So the whole thing was shaping up quite nicely, and they began to work together. And they began a process of regional integration, which it began to take very serious steps towards regional integration of a serious kind. And they all applied policies to eradicate poverty, to improve the standard of living of the population, and they're all characterized by more or less the same principle: free and universal health care and education. It's absolutely central questions. And plus, poverty eradication. To pay people benefits, bonuses of every kind, so that people were able to actually have some income and improve their lot. By 2003, 2004, which is before the change began to work their way through, the level of poverty in Latin America in total was 44%. By 2014-15, when that first wave began to go away, the level of poverty had come down to 26-25%. So in less than a decade, the left in Latin America, focusing on these things and working together, managed to get something like 100 million people out of poverty, which is, wow, extraordinary development. So everybody at the time, when we began to be defeated, were thinking, my God, what we could have done had we been given the chance to continue for, say, 5-10 more years. What messed things up was capitalism, and I want to be very precise about this. In 2008, the capitalists messed up the world economy by bringing about the massive crisis, it was the credit crunch. And we are very heavily dependent on the exploitation of raw materials, very heavily dependent, too heavily dependent. And in consequence, our economies were hit very badly, really, really badly. Just to give you an example, commodities such as, for example, raw materials in general, went down by 4%. But when you are dependent on the exploitation of raw materials, you have two consequences that follow out of that, which are part of the same process. Number one, you sell less because less is demanded. But at the same time, because less is demanded, the price goes down. So it's a double whammy. And in the case of Brazil, at the time, raw materials in general, 4% in decline, but minerals, which is what Brazil was really exporting, came down by 16%. So they all of them couldn't sustain the social programs. I mean, they wanted to, they tried every possible effort. And the United States used every single power and every possibility that they have in order to destabilize the situation. And they overthrew the government of Honduras in 2009. They did the same in the government in Paraguay in 2012. They managed to turn around the situation in Argentina in 2015. They nearly waged a successful coup d'etat in Ecuador in 2010. The president was not assassinated just because God is great. And they managed to really turn things around when they managed to impeach Dilma Rousseff, president of Brazil, the first woman president. And then they continue by ensuring that Lula was in prison, so that there would be no left-wing candidate that could win the election. But at the time, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua were pretty isolated. So the United States went really heavy against Venezuela, particularly. With Cuba in 60 years, they're used to it. But in the case of Venezuela, they applied, so far, 927 nasty sanctions, economic sanctions, 927, which affects everything, literally everything. Food particularly, food, medicine, that was priority. And then oil, gold, and everything else. So they even managed to overthrow Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2019. That was the last leg of that wave. But what is interesting, again, with the benefit of hindsight, is that the right wing, imperialism of the United States, is able to do damage, clearly, as I've demonstrated with these examples, but is unable to consolidate politically. So what he's done by applying brutal, intensifying neoliberalism, what he does, he corrodes the political base that was able to obtain during these political victories. So things last very little. So for example, in the case of Brazil, Bolsonaro was able to destroy the Brazilian economy in about 3 years. The right-wing de facto dictatorship in Bolivia was able to destroy the Bolivian economy in 11 months. In the case of Ecuador, it took them 2 years. So you can have, for example, so how can you sustain politically, especially in a by now very politicized continent, maintain political power, unless that you do it by brutal means, which some of them are still doing, such as in the case of Ecuador. So these created the conditions for the second wave. And I think the first instance of the second wave was the recovery of democracy in Bolivia. 11 months, nasty struggle, it was really tough. There are some times when there is nothing you can do, you just have to go with your bare chest and, face the music, and you get somewhere or you don't. And then that began to turn things around, and now the number of left-wing governments has increased, especially crucially strategic places. So for example, now we have a left-wing government in Mexico, which we didn't have before. And the president of Mexico is an amazing political cadre. We were all surprised. Then we have a left-wing government in Colombia, which we didn't have before. Colombia is very strategic from the point of view of the United States, because the United States installed in 2009 10 military bases in there to obviously attack Venezuela. That's the only purpose of it. So imagine if they lose the political government, the government there, then obviously that complicates things for their ability to intervene. Brazil changed things quite dramatically, and then to have Mexico complicated their life, right there. As people say, the tragedy of Mexico is to be so far from God and so close to the United States, which is a phrase that was coined by a Mexican dictator in the 19th century. So imagine it's 2,600 kilometers common border, and there are about 45 million Mexicans inside the United States. They're not leveraged for the Mexican government, but certainly it's not the same as not having them. So on this occasion, we're just beginning the second wave as we speak, more or less. I think, number one, they have learned some lessons. And I say this, with humility. I'm not trying to suggest I knew this before, I didn't. We're all learning. And one of the lessons is this: if you are a left-wing government and you begin to engage in the structural transformation of your society, if you want to defend them, you have to mobilize and organize your social base, because they will come back for you. And they will come back with everything they have. And the less you have of your base organized, the easier it's going to be for them to get rid of you, which is what happens to the Brazilians. In those places where the base is very heavily organized, you know, the FSLN in Nicaragua is one of the most militant, very well organized. If they wanted to mobilize the masses, were there to be a civil war, God forbid, they will win hands down in seconds, because you know everybody will do it right away. They have all the committees necessary. In Cuba, you have the committees of the defense of the revolution, the whole island. So, in some places, the United States may be able to win an election and therefore destroy a revolution. In Cuba, they will require a military invasion. There's no other possibility there. And it's because of that strategy, those instructions.
Nicaragua.
In Nicaragua, because it's so small, a military intervention will, the success of it will depend on how long will it take for them to control it completely. If it takes more than a week, you know, to be very precise, then the United States will be in political trouble. It will be very difficult for them, especially in the context now. But in the case of Venezuela, which has been under attack for 20-something years, they set up popular militias, which are in the constitution, by the way. The number of militia people organized in Venezuela is 4 million. No wonder the United States threatened with invasion but didn't do it. If you look at it, you think, should I go in and then what do I do after that? So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is that regional integration must be not only at the political level but also at the economic level. And during the electoral campaign, Lula made a very interesting, I would say, not confession, but you know, recognizing he made a mistake. She said that he didn't take seriously a proposal that Hugo Chavez made to him, which was to set up a single currency in the region. Now, the single currency, I know the person who proposed a single currency in the first wave, Pedro Paz, is an Ecuadorian. He's a fantastic economist. My God, this guy, for me, he's like God, you know, so good. And Pedro Paz proposed, he was given the task by Correa, President of Ecuador, and others, Chavez, said, you know, put together a proposal. And his proposal is this. It's a currency that can work through compensating mechanisms. So a sort of device, financial device, rather than a currency, but you have to call it as a currency. So, for example, if there is an exchange, then this is the proposal, obviously, it will take time for that to be established and then refined so that it works smoothly. If in the exchange of two nations, one of them has, you know, higher level of productivity, high level of economic development, and the other one doesn't, when they exchange everything, one is going to lose out, the other one is going to win out. So the compensation mechanism is to have this currency so that nobody loses. And then secondly, is to have that single currency in a fund which is very substantial through a bank that we control. And Chavez proposed a single currency and a Bank of the South. That's what he called it, Banco del Sur. Chavez, even at the time, proposed to create what people call a Latin American, South American NATO, which is not a NATO. NATO is to attack somebody. This is to defend ourselves. But there's a sort of military integration. And they created the Council of Defense of the South, which began to take place. And the military are not reliable necessarily, but you know, they obey the orders of the president. So the intention was very significant. And you could see where there were some examples, some very important successes. So Lula, just to finish that point, he said, I should have taken that seriously, and the first thing I'm going to do, as soon as I'm elected, I'm going to do exactly that. He got elected. He was elected in October. He was inaugurated on January the 1st. On January the 2nd, he signed a decree revoking all the 6 key privatizations that had been carried out under Bolsonaro. And then he went to Argentina to discuss with Alberto Fernandez, the president of Argentina, to set up this currency. Right away, boom, done. And Maduro from Venezuela said, we join you. And all the others said, of course, we're ready. So that is beginning. Obviously, it will take time. to put it together and so on. But just to give you a few examples of what can be done, then I'll deal with the complexity and I'll shut up. Cuba and Venezuela, at the time of the first wave, and this was funded with Venezuelan oil, they launched a medical initiative which is known as Operation Miracle. And Operation Miracle consisted of identifying people in the region, including the United States, poor people primarily, that had lost their eyesight because of cataracts and similar eye ailments. They would be identified, they would be flown into either Venezuela or to Cuba, where the medical facilities were, to undergo an operation. The flight would be free of charge. They will come with somebody who accompanies them, obviously. That will also be paid for and also free of charge. The operation will take place, the amount of convalescents in a hospital or clinic will be free of charge, and then they will send them back free of charge. 4 million operations in about 5 years. And then the crisis hit us. Chavez, Hugo and Fidel, if excuse the familiarity, were thinking of actually extending such a program to Africa. You know, because they knew they had the resources. Cuba is a medical world power. Venezuela is rich in oil, so everything can be done. So that tells you what could be done. And in terms of cultural developments, universities, new schools, and so on, it was just incredible. The Bolsa Familia program, which was social benefits in Brazil, which was, to give benefits to the very poor. When you're very poor, it's very difficult to get out of this cycle of poverty. So you have to break it somehow, and if you don't break it, then your kids are going to continue doing the same as your parents, and then you perpetuate poverty. So the benefits had conditionalities, which, very interesting. Normally there are conditionalities like Gordon Brown kind of conditionalities. These are not that kind. The conditionalities were, if the woman, by the way, the benefit will go to the woman, never to the man, never ever. There have to be extraordinary conditions, they have to sign documents, and they have to demonstrate that the only possibility was that the man received, otherwise they wouldn't, only the women. That's number one. And number two, the woman in charge of the money will continue receiving it, provided that he demonstrated that the kids went to school. She had to then bring the certification that the kids went to school, in order to ensure that kids, they stop being the street kids. And then he had a baby, from 0 to 5 years old. She had to demonstrate that the kid was taken to the clinic for control, for medical control. Those are essential. So imagine you begin to really transform from the bottom up. That's why in 5 years, the ruler, they took 40 million people out of poverty. 40 million. And anecdotally, I supervised a couple of PhD research on the Bolsa Familia in Brazil. And they told me that, one of the first things the women bought with the money. They asked me, what do you think they did? I said, I don't know, cosmetics, lipstick, good food, went for a drink, what? They said, no, I said, mobile. What do you mean a mobile? Yeah, a mobile phone. What for? He said, because they work as domestic servants, occasionally. And because they live in the favelas, in the shanty towns, there is no connection, and they don't have mobile phone. So when the people wanted to employ them, wanted to find them, they couldn't find them. So the first thing to do was to have these connections so that they could get the employment and increase their incomes, which is, very practical, very clever. So now we are in this second wave. These are the complexities. I'm going to cover a couple of blanket problems because it's much more complicated. Number one, the world economy is in real shite. Excuse my French. And of course, we still depend on the exploitation of commodities. That's still our weakness. But nevertheless, all of the Latin American nations, with one exception, are orienting themselves towards China. They call it Eurasia, but that's for diplomatic reasons. But it's mainly China. China is the main trading partner of all the Latin American countries. Mexico is the exception, because Mexico depends very much on the connection with the United States. 78 to 80% of imports and exports come and go from and to the United States, so that gives you an idea. And if Mexico were to extricate itself from Mexico, Mexico will collapse. Possibly parts of the United States will collapse as well, but it's no good for anybody that this happens. Several trains are being built in Mexico with Chinese technology, Chinese investment, partnership, those sort of things. And so, what I'm saying with this is, even though the situation is complex, we have an alternative. And with China, we obtain technology, investment, credit, and credit, technology, investment, and markets, large quantities of it. Just to give you an idea, in 2019, just before the pandemic, which is the figures we have for, 150 million Chinese went as tourists to the world. 150 million. So if you get 1% of that, and an economy, such as Uruguay, it's got 3 million people, you can really improve your economy in 2 seconds. And I think it's going to continue to increase. So the possibilities are gigantic. Whereas with the United States, we get nothing. We get pillage, we get brutality, we get neoliberalism, we get the offer of military bases, which are not very attractive. So that's the first thing. So that transition is complex, it's not easy. Although we already started to have good relations with China. I mean, we did an article which sort of charted a little bit of that. And the second complication is the United States is in decline, and it's in severe decline. But because of that, it's much more violent, and it could be much more dangerous. I don't think they will be able to just attack anybody, but you never know. So they have the capacity to damage, to destabilize, to destroy the economy, to complicate your things, even though they might not be able to actually control your country as they used to do with the coup d'etat and so on. And we need to recover very quickly in this context. That is to say, we need to recover the economic activity so that people start, to come back in terms of economic activity and so on. But one of the biggest advantages, it's not the only one, I'll just mention this one, is that if you take Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Mexico, the lithium deposits of those 5 countries represent 67% of the total in the world. And that's the next wave of industrial expansion. So Mexico just nationalized their lithium. They set up a state enterprise 2 days ago. The Chileans did the same. The Bolivians already have it. The Argentinians already have it. The Peruvians will have to wait because there is a coup d'etat going on. But this can be sorted. So imagine the lever that we're going to have to negotiate with anybody. The French are desperate to get there. The Americans are desperate. Everybody's desperate, and we are, we can play, not play games, but we can sort of pick and choose. So we have a substantial amount of possibilities. And there is the problem of the right wing in Latin America, is the final point. Is the problem that the right wing in Latin America are sort of becoming fascisticized. I'm not sure that's the actual verb, or whether I invented it. But they become very fascistic. Bolsonaro is an anomaly in the history of Brazil, certainly in the contemporary history. The manifestations of similar things in Chile, certainly in Venezuela, and in Nicaragua and other places is a bit worrying. And these are forces which have some mass base, and they can be mobilized to really do damage. So that's something we need to work on. Some of them, in the case of Brazil, they have religious bases, such as the evangelicals, which are quite strong. They're very poor, but they are so fanaticized, and try to persuade them that you're a liberal. The pastors the people in charge of the evangelical churches persuaded them that the candidate, when Lula couldn't be the candidate, wanted to make their kids gay by teaching them to be gay, how to become gay person, which is, ridiculous. So anyway, so it's wonderful, and we are in the vanguard of the liberation of humanity against neoliberalism. I don't think we're in a position to give lessons to anybody, but if anybody wants us to tell us how we do it, we're quite happy to do it. I'll leave it there, thank you. Ready for your questions.
Yes. Brilliant, thank you.
Do we have tea break now at this point? Because we know we have about 5 minutes. 5 minutes, people
Well,
go
we
and
want-
renew teas and coffees.
And then we have the
And then
questions and answers,
Yeah.
yeah? Serious business, and thank you very much, Francisco. It was brilliant. I'm not going to abuse my power as a chair, and I won't ask any questions. We've got lots of questions, but of course we are here to discuss and to the floor. Let's start with.
I have some.
No, I am the
some
chair, so
questions.
I'll decide.
Alright.
So
No.
let's start with that, and then Bülent, and then any because if you do it orderly, then you'll have. Would you like to?
I have-
So 1, 2. Okay.
I think I have
Okay.
questions about serious situations. Now, first I want to know what is the weight of Chinese presence in Latin American economies? What do they do? That's my first question.
Oh my God. Another
There
subject.
And secondly, what is the level of indebtedness of Latin American economies? You see, after 2008, they started giving credits for almost 0%. So everybody relies on foreign debt now, including Turkey. In our case, it is $500 billion.
Jesus.
It is unbelievable. But now it's getting
The print machine.
the percentage of
Still,
interest
it is not
rate
as bad as
is
Greece.
increasing, and they are squeezing us.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the second question.
Oh,
The
anymore?
third question, and fourth question is actually related. Now, it doesn't start with Cuba's new constitution, but it includes that as well. I think that all the socialist movements everywhere in the world, but especially in Latin America, they are retreating from the original ideals, and they are becoming, so to say, realistic. They accept management of capitalist economies for popular purposes, which is actually called social democracy. Accepting capitalism and following the social democratic ways. More organized, less organized, but they are saying more or less that. And Lula, when he made his first speech right after he was elected, he started talking about God, Jesus Christ. I said, that's it. That's it. When you start with God, Jesus Christ, that is not good at all, because of he's trying to counteract the evangelists, but doesn't matter. This is a very dangerous line of thought, I think. These are the questions. And Cuba's constitution, which gives private property almost all the necessary rights to improve, that can be called NEP in Soviet Union, but in Cuba, what shall we do after Castro?
Okay, good. Do you want to take one by one, or do you have the questions
Well,
first?
this is
There are
quite,
three questions
this is quite a
already.
mouthful, so I'm going to take this one,
Okay.
if that's okay.
Okay, so, yeah.
China is the main trading partner of most of the Latin American countries, I think all of them, with the exception of Mexico, as I said. The main contribution of China is, on the one hand, offering market, but also participating in investment in infrastructure, bridges, trains, you know, underground metros, this sort of thing. And the Chinese are very good at that. And there is a project to build a second canal in Nicaragua, which has been complicated, hasn't happened yet. But if that canal were to take place, then the Panama Canal will become redundant. And it will make the United States lose a fantastic geopolitical position, and God knows what might happen. So, what is interesting about the Chinese, I mean, the figures fluctuate because there was the amount of trade grew from about 1990, 92, from about 1% in total of the total foreign trade of Latin America to more than 45%. And then it went down again because of the fluctuations of the economy and the volatility of the commodities market. But its presence is there, and the Latin Americans reconstituted something called recently, I mean, they had the 7th summit of the Commonwealth of Latin American and Caribbean States, which is a coordination of all the states, like the Central American states. But what is different about CELAC is it specifically excludes the United States and Canada. And this has been for some time, and they met on the 7th summit, and the special guest to that meeting was Xi Jinping, who said, from our point of view, in terms of producing a better world for humanity, our relationship with Latin America is crucial. And the Chinese apply the concept of the win-win, which when I first came across it, I thought it was Chinese, but actually it's English. It means everybody wins. I thought, the Chinese, they call it win-win, which sounds like a Chinese. And the advantage is this, that when it comes to technology, for example, let me give you an example of what we're able to do. Ecuador changed completely its energetic matrix, completely, 97%. And they moved from oil and gas, which is fossil fuel, which the constitution doesn't allow it, to electricity from hydraulic power. And every single body in the country was given, the facility was arranged so that they converted to the new technology free of charge. And then these came together with appliances such as the cooker, the saucepans, and everything had to be special for that. Because if nothing is there, you touch it with your hand, it doesn't heat. But if you build that thing, which is specially designed, then it does. And they changed it 97% with Chinese. All of these appliances are Chinese. Refrigerators, microwaves, all of them. So, the amount of contribution that they made was gigantic. And I talked to, a couple of ministers and a few other important officials in Ecuador at the time, and I said, did they demand anything? No, they don't demand anything. They no conditions. What they want to make sure is that this is good business. That is to say that it produces good results, is efficient, and is implemented properly, rather than you have money, you throw it at it, and then hope something good will happen. So China, in that sense, is very good. Now, in terms of the debt level of Latin America, the country with the highest level of debt, if I recall correctly, I think is Venezuela. And it's Venezuela because it went through the terrible pandemic and the sanctions. Between 2016, 17, all the way to 2019, Venezuela lost 99% of the oil revenues that it used to get, 99%. And oil revenues represented something like 85-90% of the total budget, of the total economy. So you can imagine. The only way is to borrow money. They couldn't borrow money from the IMF because, one, they wouldn't lend it, but two, if they were to lend it, they would demand, God knows, the government is executed and then somebody is put in place. But that's where China came in, and China was extremely generous. I mean, nobody knows exactly, because the Venezuelans are very careful the way they use their figures. the total level of debt of Venezuela at the moment is something in the region of 62% of GDP, which is not much. It's not much. And the overall range, I mean, I'm thinking about the debt of most of the Latin American countries, is in the region of 30 to 40%, 45% of GDP. If you compare it with Europe, which is, you know, piece of cake.
And
So-
in the UK it's not more than
I know.
100%.
I mean, Greece is 150%.
I know. So, in that sense, Latin America doesn't have a debt problem. It used to have it. The one that is in real trouble, and I don't think it represents that much of the GDP, because the GDP of the country is about 500 billion, is Argentina. That because Macri, you know, the right-wing neoliberal swine, deliberately indebted the country to the tune of $280 billion, without the country needing it. And now the country is in real trouble to pay, and it's under tremendous contract. But that's the exception. And Alberto Fernandez, the president, is making special deals. It's a totally public. Special deals with Putin, and special deals with Xi Jinping, to make sure that, you know, they come to the rescue to help him out with his economy. And he's quickly moving towards the new currency so that the dollar is not a problem anymore. So China definitely is going to have a significant role there. Now, the debt and the complications of the economic crisis that the continent has gone through produces, in the case of Venezuela, according to the IMF, which I think was exaggerated, but it must have been really high, a level of inflation which was 1.5 million %. You know, this is worse than Germany invasion. I mean, it's much worse. 1.5 million. So the local currency, the Bolivar, you know, was worthless. And when I asked the people in charge, how did they survive? They said, well, we just had to do acrobatics. They found also the way. So, but in 2021, the level of inflation was brought down to single figures monthly, 7%, 6%, 1%. When in the year you accumulate, you know, 60, 70%, but compared to 1.5 million, that's fantastic. So what I'm saying with this is the capacity to recover and sort out the debt can be done very quickly once the economy recovers. I don't agree with your perception of the retreat. I mean, some, you know, one step forward, two steps backward. We know this one, as Lenin put it. What they've done is a sort of net in these circumstances. You know, in the case of Cuba, Cuba was able to reorganize its economy in 5 years, from sugar to tourism, in 5 years. And it reinserted itself into the world economy in 5 years, which is a miracle. You know, only they can do it, because they have a planned economy and they run the show quite seriously. They accepted the dollar to be a currency, then they rejected it. They accepted it again, then they rejected it. Then they accepted the euro, then they rejected it, and there was no complication in the economy. Doesn't mean to say there are no problems, but, you know, no massive crisis. If you were to adopt the US dollar as a currency and then you were to abandon it, you can imagine what it could do to any weak economy. Imagine, with the collapse of the USSR, Cuba lost 35% of its GDP in those 2 or 3 years. It was receiving 12 million tons of oil, subsidized from the Soviet Union, 20% of the world price. And then it was receiving food. So that's extraordinary. So they had to reorganize. And then they went for tourism, and they expanded massively from about 200,000 tourists to 5 million in no time. Cuba is a beautiful place to go. And the United States and the pandemic did the job of making it collapse. The amount of, the percentage by which tourism collapsed in Cuba was 96%. I mean, you know, it's just horrific. In Mexico, it went down by 75%. But in Cuba, which hasn't had all the other facilities that normal countries have, you know, it was 90% was terrific, horrific. So a whole sector emerged out of this. Tourism, by definition, is a fragmentary, small thing. So if you run the taxis from the state, then it's going to be inefficient. You rather allow individuals to do it. If somebody's going to take your luggage and all of the sort of things, little markets, little restaurants and so on, they allow individuals to actually set up restaurants in the front rooms of their houses. Paladares they're called, which means pallet. And they regulated so that nobody could have more than 12 chairs. If you were caught with 13 chairs, the fine would be $1,000 paid immediately. So people behave. And tourists, me included, go to those places. We don't go to hotels or anything. We go to those places, family-run restaurants. And so this is the private sector, and it's not the only one. And now what they have done is, because of this collapse of the tourism sector, it's been really hard for them. Then they changed the constitution to attract investment. And the only way you can attract investment is to make profitable for them. It makes no sense otherwise. If you say to them, come to Cuba, we'll show you how our socialism works, they're not going to come. And you need to harness those resources which are somewhere, because you want to generate investment, employment and income. There's no other way. Which other sources there are? Cuba is very poor. Venezuela has oil, assets of every kind. Cuba doesn't have anything. Nickel and sugar is gone. So that's the reason, and a very similar law has been actually implemented in Venezuela, very similar, almost identical. To make, profitable investment attractive, you have to ensure that it's profitable. And the constitutional principle in the law must say that your investment and your profit will be protected. Otherwise, they won't come. So, and when it comes to God, Lula is a Catholic. Tactically, he may have been doing what you said. I think he has been doing that to try to counteract the evangelicals, but Lula is a Catholic. He's a really strong Catholic. Chavez was a strong Catholic. Ortega is a Catholic. Maduro is Catholic. Evo Morales is Catholic. We're all Catholic, except me. So when they say, and they do this for God, to express their Catholicism in this way doesn't make them right-wing necessarily. Quite the opposite. There is a long tradition of liberation theology there. I think they identify very much with them. Chavez said, I'm Marxist. I assume Marxism. And the question is how to make a revolution in these circumstances in Latin America, with this imperialism, with this society that we have. I hope God helps me. So that's the way it is.
There are
so
also socialist Catholic priests
all
over.
So I don't think it's a.
It's a very powerful tradition. As you said, the liberation Catholic priests in Latin America, they always fought against military dictatorship, and many of them were assassinated. So this is a tradition. This doesn't make them even social democrats. They are still Marxists. So, but this is something we are not familiar with from our side of the world. That's why when we hear something religious, we think, oh, that must be right wing. But in Latin America, from the very beginning, it's always been on the left.
One clarification though. I think the Workers' Party of Brazil is social democratic, but it's a left-wing social democratic party that actually practices left-wing social democracy, whereas social democracy in Europe is not social democratic anymore.
No.
Yeah.
That's the difference. For example, Lula will give his life to ensure that every Brazilian eats 3 times a day. And he will do anything he needs in order to ensure that they eat. Any social democrat in Europe will do nothing to ensure that people have their rights. Nothing. So there is stopping social democrat. And the Workers' Party is not a revolutionary party. But it's prepared to work very nicely with revolutionaries such as Cuban, Venezuelans and others. And the other way around as well. So this complexity has to be understood.
Let's have more time for others.
Certainly, sorry.
Bülent is the next, and then Nick.
I have one question, but before that I just would like to make a few points about what you already talked, to support what you said. I also looked at the figures, I keep looking at the figures about Chinese investment in Latin America. In addition to what you said, it was given in IMF website just a few weeks ago. Since 2010, China lent money more than IMF to African and Latin American nations. So China has become the first lender now, almost replaced IMF. And because of, just you said, the conditions, the interest rates, everything is much more favorable to those nations. And China is doing this lending money, at the same time investing and building things, constructing in the country. So this works out. And China is capable of doing this because China has got the largest amount of foreign currency accounts. So they need to spend this money. And they are spending this money to expand their vision of development all over the world. The second point is, I mean, to me, this is socialism in 21st century. I mean, the main thing, because many of us don't realize how neoliberal capitalism is much worse than capitalism in general. I mean, in Latin America, the main problem was poverty. I mean, we never seen that level of poverty anywhere in Europe or even in Turkey. I mean, that level of poverty never happened in Turkey, for instance. Many of us lived in poor places. We all work among the shanty towns of Ankara, Istanbul, but it was never this level. I mean, the percentages you gave to me, 40% and 60% of the people were living under the poverty line, is extreme in the world. And so therefore, what happened is even World Bank says that what Lula did in just a few years' time, bringing those people from the poverty line up to the middle class level, they call this as a miracle. And they said never in the human history something like this was achieved in such a short period of time. So this is very important. I think, to me, if you have this level of poverty and huge gap, and then the first step is to increase people's level and to eliminate the extreme inequality. And only after that you can talk about socialism. My question is, you know, we all studied and teaching neoliberalism happened in Chile first, but I still am not sure why Chile. I mean, I know Chicago boys were trained by Milton Friedman and they went back to Chile, but there must be something structural. Why they chose Chile as the first place, first experiment?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question. You see, Ismail, we're all Maoists now. You just used to call us Marxists. We all now will go for Maoist model. So the floor is yours. I'm not a joke, it's easy.
Well, two things is, I came to the conclusion over this longer period, you know, the last 10 years perhaps, following developments in Latin America, but elsewhere, that you cannot really suppress the market. You know, the first time I made a speech like this, I was accused of being right-wing. I'm not right-wing. But you cannot do it. If you suppress the market completely, the market comes back through the window. For example, if you study the history of the Cuban economy, at the beginning there was a black market, then there was a grey market, then there was a parallel market, then there was also other markets, then finally there's a private market. 40, 50, 60 years, the market is always there. And people find ways of, you know, using market mechanism spontaneously to do it. So you cannot really suppress it. And these possibly under communism in the future, but for the time being you can't. And it's quite important, especially in economies which are so fragmented and so poor, that you actually harness those to ensure that the society is sort of guiding in that direction. Nicaragua almost doesn't have a working class. It almost doesn't. I mean, there is some working class there, but almost there isn't one really. Most of the people are small entrepreneurs, street vendors. You know, pretty entrepreneurs, pretty bourgeois from a sociological point of view. And Nicaragua is 90% self-sufficient in food. And they organize these people in cooperatives, in all sorts of organizations. Every street vendor, even people who play clown in the streets, you know, to get some money, they have a pension system for them. which is incredible. And they're all part of this system, and it's private. And I remember teasing the Nicaraguan ambassador in one European country. I said, why are you organizing this petty bourgeois revolution? You know, what do you think you're doing? I was really being provocative. And he tried to defend himself. He said, no, the working class is very important. I said, no, it's not. And then eventually I told him, you know, the real reason is taking my hat off for you being able to do this. There is no other way to do it in our societies. I think possibly you may be able to do it in Argentina, where you have a strong, really strong working class. I mean, sociologically and demographically. 60–70% are working class in the traditional sense, and they're extremely militant. But that's an exception. And I think Brazil is in some way the same. They didn't choose Chile, they just happened, they were able to wage the coup, and they took advantage of the situation. And the reason why it worked, because neoliberalism hasn't worked anywhere else. Absolutely, and everywhere else it's just a complete disaster. Even for those who, whatever they want out of it, they get, you know, temporary benefit, but they wreck the economy. They benefited from the structural transformation having been carried out by Salvador Allende, particularly the land reform. And one of the things that the military didn't do was to return the land to the landowners. They never did that. And the second thing they didn't do, which Allende nationalized the copper industry that was in US hands.
That was a trigger, wasn't it?
And yeah, but the military did not return it. They didn't privatize it. They kept it. And the reason is, you know, the amount of resources that come into the state from this industry is crucial. And the military realized, even advised by their own, you know, Chicago bodies, that it didn't make economic sense. So these two things make sense because by eliminating these obstacles to development, such as, you know, the peasantry that was not living in an economy that is not monetized, they expanded the market massively. But at the same time, the various other structural transformations that took place, particularly the nationalization of the copper industry, these two together were maintained, and then they went for, you know, expanding what they call non-traditional exports. And they massively expanded wine, grapes, salmon, and a few other things, apples, and Chilean food is fantastically nice. I'm not patriotic, so they are nice. So these things actually paid off, and throughout the 90s and part of the 21st century, the Chilean economy was growing at a rate of 6 to 8% per year. And this is what did it. So the trickle-down effect did work there, you know, to the extent that I'm telling you, such as 8% of poverty. The level of unemployment in Chile now is 4.5% right now. So I think that's what it is. But anywhere else, it was a complete horrible disaster.
Nick, thank you. Before I just come to you, Nick, I think there's this fallacy that, oh, socialism is against market per se. You know, Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese model we have, and, you know, then you know, when he said that we can't share poverty, you know, we have to have market to generate wealth first, and then we share it, as we know. And then, you know, when my students say, oh, but China is communist, but there is a still market economy. I said, nobody says China is, even Xi Jinping says, China is, the aim of China is socialism. Of course, because, anyway, that's a different debate. But, Nick.
I'm tempted to get in on that debate, but I'll stick with the question I was going to ask first, which is about how left-wingers are elected in Latin America, and the you have presidential systems almost exclusively in Latin America, and quite often you'll get a left-wing presidential candidate will win the election, but they won't have much in the way of control of the Congress, and this causes all kinds of political crises. It's Allende had that. He had to use presidential decrees to get most of his stuff through, and his ministers kept getting thrown out by the Congress and all of that. They got the nationalisation of copper through with the support of the Christian Democrats. early on, but then that alliance fell away. So in some countries they've managed to get control of the assembly, but in others not. Lula has difficulties as a result of that. So it seems to me that the presidential system actually gives an opportunity for left-wing presidents to be elected because it's a majoritarian thing. You just have to win that one election, while winning candidates all across the country involves a kind of mass movement that they don't. So the Workers' Party can win the presidency, but it can't win the assembly in Brazil. Could you perhaps elaborate on why that is the case? And then, since Ishmael was able to ask 4 questions, perhaps I could ask a second question as well of the chair.
Yes, of course, because that has already been done.
Yeah,
so
I can seize the opportunity. So, in terms of economic development, I think it's a very important point that you made about the fact that you've got huge disparities of levels of economic development in Latin America, from the southern cone, if you like, where maybe most of the development is, and perhaps in Mexico as well, building stuff for the United States. But in between, there is a high level of what you described as where of people working outside of the informal economy. And I think you're right. People who work in the informal economy, even if they're really impoverished, still have a petty bourgeois type of mentality, because they're having to duck and dive, and they're interested in making money and all of that. So that's a huge social and political issue in and of itself, and it's equivalent to what in the Soviet Union in the early days was a huge issue for them, how you keep the alliance with the peasantry together, who have a different perspective on things from the working class, and the new economic policy was an attempt to do that. But it wasn't just sort of expanding the market and enabling capitalism. It was specifically the aim, as Lenin and Bukharin articulated it, was to encourage the peasantry to work in a more cooperative way, and to sort of build a road towards a different kind of society and economy. So make that point. But this is sort of 2A question. In terms of the first wave of left-wing governments, what did they achieve in terms of actual economic development, as opposed to dispersing the benefits of the commodity boom and all of that? And Venezuela is a prime example, where they were talking about endogenous economic development and building cooperatives and all of that, and sort of developing agriculture. But I get the impression they didn't make a lot of progress on that front, or it was undermined, or it's been undermined since. So.
Okay. Yeah, in some countries such as Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela, Nicaragua is a traditional revolution where it took power by arms, by armed struggle. The Constituent Assembly was the mechanism. As there is a movement that creates the political conditions for these presidents to be elected, with the benefit of hindsight, unless you hit the iron while it's hot, then you might lose the momentum. And the Bolivians took a long time to get there, but they insisted on ensuring that there was a Constituent Assembly. Morales was elected in 2005, they got their Constituent Assembly in 2009, and the Constitution in 2009. And the new Constitution actually is transformed society completely. And the amount of legitimacy that you obtain, not only because of the mobilization, because of the new political context, but also because of the legitimacy that gives the Constitution, allows them to do everything. to put the different example, I mean, that was the case in Ecuador. Ecuador was a betrayal, you know, Lenin Moreno betrayed the revolution. So it wasn't as a result of a counter-revolution from below. And in the case of Venezuela, it's also the Constitutional Assembly. But if you take the negative example, Pedro Castillo was elected in Peru in massive mobilization, which surprised everyone. Because of clientelism, the elite is able to master, particularly Lima, but also key other cities, Arequipa and so on. And as a consequence of that, they were able to maintain a huge amount of, you know, positions in Congress. When Pedro Castillo was elected, he must have commanded something in the region of 20 MPs in an assembly of 139. So, but his mistake, I can say that, I suppose, his mistake was that he came to office by promising a constituent assembly that he was going to go against this rotten, corrupt parliament. And parliament is the most, you know, discredited institution in the country, then and even more so now. So rather than calling for this, he began to maneuver parliamentarily, in a parliamentary sense. The result we know. And he should have done it. So what happens is the massive rebellion that is taking place now could have been mastered at the beginning, and you didn't have to go through this. So eventually I think we'll get there, but you know, it will take what it will take. So that's the key. And in the case of Brazil, the Brazilians, Lula, although these massive gains that people make, you know, for the eradication of poverty and so on, they never touched the state, the structures, didn't touch them at all. Not only they demobilized their political base, which is a mistake, obviously, but they never transformed that. They transformed the state structures. The state structure of Brazil is a patrimonial state, it's nearly a feudal state. It's got neoliberalism built into it as well on top of that. So now they realize they have to really do something about it, and they're beginning to sort of discuss reform of the judiciary, and all sorts of other reforms. Let's see how far they get, but that, I think, to me is the key. So winning the presidency in a presidential system will allow you to actually do that, provided that you take advantage of the moment. And if you don't, then obviously they will take advantage of the moment and they will lose. But in terms of the various, you know, sociological dimensions of, say, 65%, 70% in the informal sector, I was privileged to talk to the the president of the commission, the Economic Commission of Bolivia, you know, appointed by the president, by Evo Morales. This was in 2010, I think, with a trade union delegation. And he showed us, you know, what they were doing, and showed us maps. He said, we're industrializing the minerals, this mineral here, we're industrializing here, we're industrializing here, my God, it was incredible. So I remember, you know, feeling very clever. I said, oh, that's great. I said, so Bolivia will never have to face the problems, you know, the commodities in the world causing trouble and then you suffering. He looked at me, he said, Francisco, you don't understand anything. I said, I'm sorry, possibly not. He said, what we're doing, he said, is we're creating the working class that is going to defend the proletariat, that is going to defend the social revolution we're trying to make. That's what we're doing. I nearly cried when he said that. So there is a clear consciousness that you need to, on the one hand, take a stock of the reality as it is and try to harness it as much as possible with all the contradictions that will create, and work on the contradictions, but at the same time transform the sociology of the country, the social composition of the country. And I think in terms of the first wave, what they managed to do was to, on the one hand, politicize society in general, which is, you know, the memory is very fresh. We're talking about 10 years ago, even less than that. That's number one. Number two, the amount of nationalizations that were carried out during the first wave is unbelievable. Telecommunications, steel, iron, you name it, you know, it was nationalized. Lithium, gas, oil, and so on and so forth. So that is, the right wing finds it very difficult to go against that. And in the case where this has taken place, the privatizations have taken place, such as Brazil, on the 2nd of January 2023, when Lula had been inaugurated 24 hours before, he issued a decree revoking all the privatizations of Bolsonaro right away, and it was welcomed by the population. And he's moving very hard, very rapidly, and he's in a hurry. He knows that he's got to take the momentum. In terms of the composition of Congress, people say that he's got what they call jogo de cintura, which I'm sure you understand, which is he's got the ability to maneuver his way around it, and he's very good at that, and only he can do it. And he's been able to actually persuade the center of politics, particularly those MPs, to support everything he's doing. And he's de-Bolsonarizing the state, which is quite important. Not only he's purging the army, we've seen generals being dismissed by him, not one, several. He's purging the federal police, he's purging the federal highway police, and he's going to dismiss, sacked from state positions throughout the state, throughout Brazil, of 8,000 military officers that Bolsonaro appointed, trying to militarize society with Bolsonarista supporters. And Lula is stamping out on this very quickly, and he's got the support not only of the center of the right wing, but also of the political establishment of Brazil, including the media, which I'm shocked about, but it's true. And I think the key reason is they realize that Bolsonaro destroyed the economy and they want profits. And the only person that can produce economic growth is Lula and the coalition. Nobody else could have done it. That's what they're supporting. It's incredible. An extreme right-wing magazine, Veja, which is disgusting when I think about it, I want to puke. They said that the main threat against democracy in the front page, the main threat against Brazilian democracy was fascist Bolsonaro. This has never happened before in Brazil. So there is a momentum that he's getting. We'll see how far he gets. And in terms of all the gains is the politicization and the education of so many. The young, if you go to Venezuela and you go to a supermarket and you buy a bag of rice, in a popular supermarket, and here it tells you the specification of the product. At the back there is articles of the Constitution of what tells you what they're entitled to. That's with beans, that's with flour, that's with sugar, that's with everything. So this is not lost. And that's why we came back so quickly after that.
Okay. Ismail has got another question, but before Ismail, any questions? Other?
Thank you, Francisco. On the Brazil point, I want to ask, I guess when I think about Brazil, and obviously just anecdotally, the Brazilians I know, I always think, who is voting for Bolsonaro? Like, who are these people? I've never met them. When you think of this phantom right wing, and in your talk you kept referring to they, as you would say the US, and I think maybe simplistically, I always imagine in the history of Latin America, by nature, most countries are intrinsically more left-wing. Is that because they were colonies? It feels more left-wing, and then the US was always the one that kind of interfered and created coups, etc. But now the US is in decline. So is that still the case? But is there an organically grown right-wing, I guess is what I'm asking. Like in Brazil, if we were to cut off the influence of the US, it no longer exists. Is that there still a significant threat? And is that, do you think, different by country? So, and then I guess the evangelical thing is an added element, but I guess what I'm asking is who is the biggest threat to all of this? And then my second thing, it's not really a question, it's more just a reflection. With Dilma, I guess, what happened to Dilma? With a lot of the language and the whole childcare either, and Bolsonaro, I think the attack on women, especially in that, was so significant. And I guess I'm waiting, where's the next strong, amazing, radical female leader? Because to me, until that happens, I can't even imagine what Brazilian women or Latin American women or women are feeling. Do you know what I mean? And maybe you know more than me. Is there someone, a really exciting new leader that we can be kind of hoping on?
Those are good questions.
I mean, at the moment, what appeared that an impossible task, which was, how to deal with Bolsonarismo, has been dealt with very quickly. Bolsonaro is hiding away in Florida. And he's trying to go to Italy. There is a campaign by Italian friends of mine, not because of me, but they're carrying a campaign to ensure that he doesn't get shelter there. And Bolsonaro is sort of trying to negotiate with the Supreme Court to come back, and he's going to come back at some point, and the Supreme Court has decided they're going to indict him. if you are able to get ahead and then are able to dismantle all of these things, Bolsonarism is beginning to fade away. It was a sort of anomaly, you know, that took everybody by surprise. Was the ascendancy of Trump and that sort of international movement that the United States able to do this. And then the economic crisis combined with that created the conditions for, you know, the right wing to come back to power. But the political party, the PSDB, which is the traditional political party in Brazil that wins election by 48 or 52, 54%, was reduced to less than 2%. First 10% and then 2%. And in the last election, they had to fall behind a candidate who was called 3%. So they themselves couldn't actually do anything. So that gives you an idea that at the time, when there was the election, the candidate that emerged was Bolsonaro, with these very few prejudices, you know, racist campaign and so on. I think the problem in that, in the case of Bolsonarismo, the main threat is not Bolsonarismo anymore. Biden doesn't want Bolsonaro in the presidency of Brazil. That's why the United States did not intervene in the election. I mean, I'm sure they intervened, but not doing nasty things. To have President Bolsonaro in Brazil as president, aligning themselves with, you know, Trump, and the election took place before the midterm election, because Lula was elected in October, and the elections in the United States midterm was in November. So Biden did not intervene in the election in Honduras, a country they total control. And the reason was because if the right wing were to have won there, then there would have been a caravan that would explode in their faces, and it would be capitalized by Trump and company. So there is this peculiarity, and the United States not the same, because they have the internal problems, you know, which is advantageous to us, then they cannot. The main threat is if Lula fails in satisfying, sorting out the problems that they have. According to him, Bolsonaro left, you know, an economy with 33 million people who do not eat 3 times a day. That's number one. And 100 million people poor. So this is what? The population of Brazil is 220. So that is very serious. So if he fails, then God knows what it is. In terms of who are the Bolsonaristas, I know Brazil pretty well. I've been there many times. I learned Portuguese by living there. These sections of the middle class and particularly the middle class, the elite couldn't care too much, but the middle class are so intensely racist. They really, I mean, it's so intense that it's unbelievable. So when they have they try to hide it and try to control themselves when you see them and so on. But for them to see, excuse my language, blackies, sort of moving up and getting closer to them, it makes them sick. And they want to kill them, they hate them, they think they're monkeys or worse. I mean, they're really, really intense. And particularly in Sao Paulo, this is the worst part of it. So,
Which one?
Sao Paulo.
Industrial.
Yeah, so from that point of view, when there is a crisis, and there is what people perceive as existential, and there is evangelical, and you know, the communists and corruption, God knows what, they threw everything into the cocktail. These people were persuaded to arm themselves. And Bolsonaro issued several decrees that allowed them to, I don't know, tens, hundreds of thousands of weapons were sold. And these were people were armed to actually ensure that they killed these people when they attacked them, which they never did. So now this is sort of coming down. And that represents, I would say, in the Brazilian population, what, less than 10%. But because they are at that level, you know, they have significance. Their views are expressed in the news, in the media. They have access to books, articles, they write stuff, etc. So that's the problem. And I don't think it's the same in every city, but certainly in Sao Paulo. If I would remember advising them, I said, what I would do if I were you, I would organize a liberation army in the whole of the rest of the country and invade Sao Paulo and sort it out that way. They were laughing at me and said, I wish we could, we told me. So that's the problem. I think we'll see how far it goes, but the main threat is that one. Brazil has the capacity, has the potential to explode into growth in no time. We'll see how it goes.
Thank you. One question.
No, there was a question of women.
There's another question.
No, there was a question of
Something
women.
about female.
I'm sorry, sir.
The one that was very promising was Cristina Fernandez.
Okay, Argentina. Yeah.
Yeah, she's so tough, she's so good, she's so fantastic, she's so articulate, she's so eloquent, you know, so wonderful. But she cannot win an election. The country is too bloody conservative, and the Peronist movement, which is the one where she is part of, is sufficiently not left-wing. It's left-wing, but it's sufficiently not left-wing, or not left-wing enough to actually go for her as a candidate. And she made the decision, in order to maintain the unity of the Peronist movement, that she was not going to be the presidential candidate in the last election. And she catapulted Fernandez to make sure that Alberto Fernandez actually was the president. And she is taking the back seat. And she's not intervening. And that is the best option. Gilma is going to be the president of the BRICS Bank, appointed by Lula. So she's going to have an international role. And in terms of, you know, Nicaragua is number 5 or 7 in terms of gender gap in the world, below Norway. And Venezuelan institutions are run pretty much by women at every single level, including at the level of the grassroots committee. So things are getting there, but one person, you know, not yet, I'm afraid.
Okay, we got, what time is it now? 10 minutes. Any other questions? Because you're waiting to ask a question. Well, just one question.
Yeah,
right?
a few things. Just to complete her question, what happened to Chilean female socialist president? What is she doing? She was a socialist. What has become of her?
She became a commissioner for human rights with the United Nations after she lost the election. And then from that position she played a sort of ambiguous role, to be generous. She signed several reports and statements from that commission, from that committee, that were extremely unfair and biased against Venezuela, Nicaragua, and everybody else on the left. And she just signed it. People were very unhappy with it. The Venezuelans were very clever, you know, they welcomed her, they invited her to come to Venezuela several times, and she kept making silly statements. I call them silly. And then when it came to the crisis that we just had recently, where there was a social explosion and an election, she decided not to participate. And she sort of once, I think, hinted that she would do it, but then she decided not to. I think she's not going to be in the future, you know, a candidate anymore. I think I doubt very much. And we have now this guy called Boric, who's, to say that Michelle was ambiguous when it came to the question of human rights and attacking Venezuela and so on, Boric is much worse.
Okay. Any comments or questions?
Yeah, maybe comments, maybe questions. Before coming here, I was at EMAR building, reading the newspapers, all our newspapers, Workers' Voice, 1979, just before the 1980 coup. And Social Democrats, led by Ecevit, was in power as a coalition. But we were calling there is a risk of fascism. Fascism is coming. But at the situation at the time, Social Democrat Party, we were describing it as a social soup. You can find any people from different part of the community, different classes, but leading person, people in the party was liberals. And what happened, although there was a revolutionary situation in Turkey before the coup, because when we call revolutionary situation, we meant the bourgeoisie cannot govern anymore. and there are mass protests in the streets, thousands of people in the streets, and left wings organized but not good enough. There are many fractions, and what happened? Just before there was an incident, I remember, just before the coup, General Evren, the coup d'etat leading person, was against U-2 airplanes, you know, the spy airplanes of America, to use them on the Soviet Union. And Social Democrats says, look, our general is anti-American, he is wonderful hero or something like that. But we all know at that time, in a few years' time, nobody needs U2 type of spy airplane because everybody will watch each other from the satellites. So this was the situation. What happened? Coup d'etat happened. Now we are in Turkey, 2023. There is a risk of fascism again, by maybe Erdogan, maybe someone else, maybe army. Again, the most organized party is Social Democrats, opposition. But you gave an example of Lula in Brazil. But as soon as he comes to the power, and his fist and sort some part of problems, we can come out supporting Bolsonaro. But in Turkey, if elections happened and Social Democrats come power, nobody guarantee they will act the same as Lula in Brazil. And what you think about it? Because it looks like Latin America. Because years ago, in 1970s again, there were many singers and musicians who were coming from Chile to Turkey, and we were listening to them. Some of them went back to Chile. I cannot remember his name.
Victor Jara.
Yeah, Victor Jara.
Into EMAR.
Yeah. So most probably there is even the election happens after the elections. If Social Democrats and the coalition came power, I don't think they are going to be sharp enough like Lula. What do you think? If you compare Turkey and
Just, do you want? Okay. Okay, that's good.
If I can give an advice, we build the Workers' Party in Turkey. I think the conditions are very different. The Workers' Party has been in power from 2002, won the election in 2006 again, he won it again in 2010, he won it again in 2014, and he won it again now. And Lula said he's going to be the candidate in 4 years' time. So, and the Workers' Party is a political party of 3 million members. And when he wins, in the last election, he won 60 million votes. So we're talking about, a force which was established in 1979 by the trade unions, by Lula himself as a metal worker, metal trade union worker. So you have something which is one of the biggest proletarian parties in the world.
And that is missing in Turkey completely.
Yeah. Because that's what I mean.
Also the so-called coalition is claiming that they can run neoliberalism better. So there's no awareness whatsoever of...
No, sure, but what I was trying to address was, how can you, be quick about it? Well, unless you have that sort of political context, you cannot do it.
It's nearly 8:30. I'm just going to sacrifice my questions. I can always ask you.
Sure.
So thank you very much. It has been a fantastic session. I think we should end it here and then...
Just one phrase at the end, if that may. The continent has a potential which is extraordinary. Cuba is a world medical power. Brazil is the 7th or 8th largest industrial country in the world. Venezuela has the largest deposit of oil and gold in the world.
What about China?
Well, we're talking about Latin America. And, Argentina is an agricultural world power as well. And so on and so on. Bolivia has more gas than you can imagine. So if you put all of this together, the potential is so gigantic. And, if you put oil and medics together, the Operation Miracle was 4 million people with their eyesight restored. So that's why not only I'm optimistic from the political point of view, but also I'm optimistic from the economic point of view. And, if there is anything to learn from Latin America, I'm not sure this can be taught, but it's resilience, we keep fighting back. There's nothing we can do.
Plus a strong workers' movement.
Yeah.
We lack in Turkey.
Let's find out, guys, how we can go and ask citizenship.
So anyway, thank you very much.
On that note, thank you very much.
I can have a word with Maduro.